Elon Musk forces son to marry Black Maid. What happens next is shocking. The faint hum of a chandelier above echoed across the high ceilings of the grand Musk estate. Every surface sparkled, polished to perfection. The guests, a collection of executives, politicians, and socialites, milled about the expansive ballroom, sipping from delicate champagne flutes and flashing polite smiles as they spoke in hushed, measured tones. It was another extravagant evening, the kind Elon Musk's family regularly hosted. Near the entrance, where the light dimmed and the laughter softened, stood Grace. She clutched a silver tray tightly, her slender fingers digging into its edges. The crisp black and white uniform she wore, a starched apron tied around her waist, seemed to absorb every whisper of disdain that floated her way. She stood still, her posture straight, her face calm, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Guests passed her by, barely acknowledging her presence. An older woman in an opulent gown waved her away impatiently. A man with a monocle and booming voice brushed too close, nearly knocking the tray from her hands. Grace whispered a quiet apology as the man scoffed and moved on, already forgetting she existed. In that moment, Grace spotted Elon Musk's youngest son, Nathan Musk, weaving his way through the crowd. Unlike the guests in tuxedos and gowns, Nathan wore an untucked shirt and loafers, his discomfort obvious. He looked out of place, almost as out of place as Grace. "Nathan," barked an older man nearby, one of Elon's associates, judging by his diamond-studded cufflinks. "Your father's expecting you to take the stage soon. Say a few words. Show the investors why the Musk name still matters." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he forced a weak smile. "Sure," he muttered, avoiding the man's gaze. Grace shifted, her eyes dipping back to the tray in her hands. That's when it happened. A guest bumped into Nathan, sending the champagne glass in his hand spinning through the air. The glass shattered at Grace's feet, droplets of golden liquid splashing across her polished shoes. The room went quiet. "Good Lord," came the sharp voice of a woman nearby. "Can someone clean this up? Do your job, girl." Grace flinched, swallowing hard as a low murmur of judgment rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned to her, some bored, others irritated, as if the accident had been her fault. Nathan looked mortified. I'm sorry. That was my fault," he said quickly, his voice barely audible. But no one paid attention. All they saw was Grace, the maid, the help. "Unbelievable," hissed a man in a tailored suit. "You'd think the staff could be more careful at events like this." Grace bent down quickly, her face hot, her eyes stinging as she picked up shards of glass with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You're sorry?" snapped the woman who had spoken earlier. "Are apologies going to clean my shoes?" Nathan stepped forward, his expression one of frustration. "Hey, leave her alone," he said, his voice firmer now. "She didn't do anything wrong." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Oh, so you're defending her now? Maybe she's your charity case tonight." Grace's head jerked up, her face paling as the words struck like a slap. She wanted to disappear, to shrink away from the stares drilling into her like hot knives. "Nathan," came another voice, low and measured, but commanding. Elon Musk himself had entered the room. The air seemed to shift, the quiet deepening. Elon was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, his bow tie immaculate, his presence commanding respect. Guests instinctively turned toward him, straightening up as though sensing his authority without him saying a word. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his gaze sharp as it swept the scene. Nathan turned toward his father, his voice defensive. "It wasn't Grace's fault," he said quickly. "I dropped the glass." Elon's eyes flicked to Grace, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She felt pinned beneath that gaze, like a spotlight had been turned on her. But Elon said nothing. Instead, he turned back to Nathan and motioned for him to step forward. "We'll discuss this later," Elon said, his tone clipped but calm. Nathan hesitated, casting one last apologetic glance toward Grace before reluctantly following his father toward the stage. As soon as they were gone, the whispers started up again. "I don't know why they hire people like her," one woman muttered, loud enough for Grace to hear. "She probably doesn't even have papers," another guest sneered, his words punctuated by a snide laugh. Grace froze, the glass trembling in her hands. "Doesn't have papers." The words lingered, sharp and cruel, echoing through her mind. How could they know? How could they even guess? She had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve their judgment. But still, it followed her, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. "She shouldn't be here," the man continued, shaking his head. "Elon ought to be more careful with the people he allows in his house. Can you imagine the scandal?" Grace clenched her teeth, her heart hammering in her chest as the whispers continued. "She shouldn't be here." That sentence played over and over again. A hand touched her shoulder. Startled, Grace turned to see Margaret, the head maid, crouching beside her. Margaret's face was kind but weary, her voice soft as she said, "Ignore them, Grace. They don't know what they're talking about." Grace swallowed hard, nodding faintly. "I'm fine," she whispered. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Not at all. Margaret gave her a small, understanding smile before rising to her feet and guiding Grace toward the side of the room. As they moved away, Grace could still feel the weight of the guests' eyes on her, their judgment like poison in her veins. "Just take a moment," Margaret said quietly. "I'll take care of the rest." Grace nodded, grateful for the reprieve, though she doubted it would last. This wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel small, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But as she stood in the quiet corner of the ballroom, something stirred inside her. A mixture of frustration, exhaustion, and something else she couldn't quite name. She glanced toward the stage, where Elon Musk stood now, addressing the crowd. His voice carried easily, clear and steady, but Grace barely heard the words. All she could think about was the whispers, the stares, and the nagging fear that no matter how hard she worked, she would never escape their judgment. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, somehow, everything was about to change. The ballroom had resumed its rhythm, voices humming, champagne glasses clinking, and polished laughter bubbling through the crowd. The shattered glass had been swept away, and the incident seemingly forgotten by everyone except Grace. She remained near the shadowy edge of the room, clutching a clean tray with white-knuckled fingers. Her breathing had slowed, but her cheeks still burned from the accusations. She shouldn't be here. That cruel sentence echoed in her mind. "Don't let them see you upset," Margaret whispered, coming up beside her with quiet footsteps. "These people look for weakness. You give them nothing." Grace forced a nod, though her stomach churned with frustration. "It's not fair," she murmured, her voice nearly drowned by the crowd's chatter. "I didn't do anything wrong." Margaret sighed, her gaze flicking toward the guests. "Life isn't fair in places like this," she said softly. "You get through it by keeping your head down and your heart strong." Grace looked away, biting back tears. She had heard similar words her whole life. Keep your head down. Don't speak up. Don't be seen. But tonight, something about tonight felt different. The whispers weren't just cruel, they were dangerous. From across the room, Nathan Musk spotted Grace lingering near the corner, her shoulders tight, her face set in a mask of forced composure. He frowned, his lips pulling into a thin line as he watched the crowd sneer and gossip like wolves circling a wounded lamb. "What's the deal with her?" Nathan turned sharply to see a familiar voice, Gregory Barron, an investor in his father's ventures and one of the most insufferable guests at every Musk-hosted event. Gregory was everything Nathan despised about these gatherings. Smug, entitled, and always looking for someone to demean to make himself feel bigger. Gregory tilted his glass toward Grace with a snide grin. "Is she one of those charity hires?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "She looks like she wandered in from the street." Nathan's jaw clenched, his fists curling at his sides. "She's doing her job," he said flatly. "Maybe you should focus on yours." Gregory snorted, undeterred. "Relax, kid. Just making an observation. You know these people. They're always trying to get something for nothing." Nathan whipped his head around, his glare sharp enough to cut steel. "These people?" he repeated icily. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Gregory laughed, though there was no warmth in it. "Oh, come on, Nathan. Don't be so sensitive. It's just how things are. You think she's here because she earned it?" Before Nathan could respond, another voice chimed in. This one a bit louder, a bit crueler. "You know, I heard she might not even be here legally." Nathan turned toward the new voice, a woman in a deep emerald dress, holding a champagne flute like it was a weapon. Her words carried like poison, and the people around her leaned in, hungry for gossip. "Excuse me?" Nathan snapped, his face darkening. The woman shrugged, her expression smug. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Don't act like you don't notice these things. You'd think the Musk family would have better standards for their staff." Grace had heard every word. She felt them hit like tiny shards of glass, sharp and wounding. Her chest tightened, and she turned away, desperate to escape the stares that followed her like shadows. "Not here legally." The words lodged in her mind, dragging up old fears she'd spent years trying to bury. Nathan had had enough. "Do you even hear yourself?" he said, his voice low and cold as he turned to face the crowd. "You're standing here in a room full of wealth and privilege, and you're picking on someone who works harder in a day than most of you do in a lifetime." A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, but Nathan didn't care. His voice rose, sharp and unapologetic. "Do you even know her name? It's Grace. Not the help, not charity hire. Grace." The woman in the emerald dress blinked, caught off guard by Nathan's anger. Gregory let out a forced laugh, trying to deflect. "Nathan, calm down. You're making a scene." "Maybe a scene needs to be made," Nathan shot back. Across the ballroom, Elon Musk stood near the stage, watching the growing commotion with an expression that gave away nothing. His hands were still in his pockets, and he exchanged a quick word with one of the event organizers before turning his gaze back to Nathan and Grace. Meanwhile, Grace had disappeared from view, slipping out of the ballroom and into the quieter hallway beyond. Her shoes clicked against the marble floors as she moved quickly, her breath shallow. She didn't stop until she reached the kitchen, where the air smelled of pastries and freshly brewed coffee. Margaret followed closely behind, her brow furrowed with concern. "Grace," she said softly, "what are you doing?" Grace placed the tray on the counter, her hands shaking as she braced herself against the cool surface. "I can't go back out there," she whispered. "They think I don't belong. They think I'm illegal." Margaret's expression softened, and she placed a hand on Grace's back. "They don't know you," she said gently, "and they don't know what they're talking about." Grace shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Their words stick. They always do." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps interrupted her. Both women turned to see Nathan Musk standing in the doorway, his expression tight with frustration. "Grace," Nathan said, his voice softer now, "you don't have to let them talk to you like that. You don't deserve this." Grace straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Nathan paused, as though caught off guard by the question. "Because it's wrong," he said finally. "And because you're not just the help, you're a person. You're Grace." For the first time that night, something in Grace's chest loosened, though she wasn't sure if it was relief or sadness. Before she could respond, Nathan continued, "My father's about to make a speech, but after that, I'm not letting this go. Promise you." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding as a sliver of hope cut through her doubt. But even as Nathan spoke, she couldn't shake the nagging fear that tonight's whispers were far from over. In the distance, applause erupted as Elon Musk stepped onto the stage, his voice echoing faintly through the hallways as he began his address to the guests. Grace glanced toward the sound, her mind spinning. Something's about to change, she thought. She just didn't know how. The sound of applause thundered faintly through the hallways as Elon Musk's speech carried on in the ballroom. Each cheer seemed to mock Grace, reminding her of the wall that separated her from the people inside. She lingered near the kitchen doorway, the heat of shame still clinging to her skin like an unwelcome shadow. Margaret stood beside her, her face lined with quiet concern. "You're stronger than this, Grace," she said softly, brushing crumbs off her apron as though trying to distract herself. I've been working here long enough to know people like them. People who think kindness is weakness. Grace's lips tightened into a thin line, her gaze fixed on the tray she'd abandoned. Maybe kindness is weakness, she muttered, her voice low. What good has it done me? They'll always see me as less. Before Margaret could respond, footsteps echoed sharply through the hallway. Nathan Musk strode in, his face flushed with barely contained anger. The sleeves of his untucked shirt had been pushed up, and his typically calm demeanor had cracked. There you are, Nathan said breathlessly, stopping in front of Grace. You okay? Grace blinked, thrown off by the genuine concern in his voice. I'm fine, she said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. Nathan's jaw clenched, his hands pressing to his hips as he shook his head. No, you're not, he snapped. I heard what they were saying. I heard all of it. You don't need to get involved, Grace said firmly, straightening her posture. This isn't your problem. Nathan's eyes narrowed, his voice low and steady now. They made it my problem when they decided humiliating you was entertainment. Those people, Gregory, that woman in green, they're vultures. And they're wrong. Grace turned away, her chest tightening as frustration bubbled inside her. Why do you even care? She asked, her voice rising slightly. You're one of them. You don't know what it's like to be treated like you don't belong. Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but a sharp voice cut through the hallway before he could. What's going on here? They both turned to see Gregory Barron stepping into the kitchen, his smug grin plastered across his face. He'd discarded his champagne flute in favor of a whiskey tumbler, the ice clinking softly as he swirled it. His gaze slid over Grace like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. Well, Gregory drawled, raising an eyebrow at Nathan. Slumming it with the help? Are we? Nathan's fists curled at his sides, his patience visibly fraying. Get out of here, Gregory, he said through gritted teeth. Gregory ignored him, turning his attention fully to Grace. You know, I've been thinking, he said, his voice loud and deliberate. You don't really fit in here, do you? I mean, you look out of place. Maybe it's because you are out of place. Grace stiffened, her heart pounding. She could feel Margaret tense beside her, ready to step in, but Grace lifted a hand, silently asking her to stay back. I'm just doing my job, Grace said quietly, though her voice wavered slightly. Gregory laughed, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. Oh, I'm sure you are. You're lucky to even have a job here, though, aren't you? I mean, no one really checks, do they? Whether someone like you belongs here. Legally, I mean, the room fell deathly quiet. Even Margaret sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes darting nervously to Nathan. Nathan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. That's enough, Gregory smirked, shaking his head. Relax, Nathan. I'm just asking questions. Questions everyone's thinking, but no one has the guts to say out loud. You're a coward, Nathan shot back, his voice rising. You talk big because you know you're surrounded by people who think like you. But you're wrong about her, and you know it. Gregory's grin faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing. Careful, Nathan, he sneered. You don't want to embarrass yourself. Nathan took another step forward, squaring his shoulders. I'd rather embarrass myself than stand here and let you treat someone like trash. Grace's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears, as she watched Nathan stand up for her. No one had ever spoken for her like that before, certainly not someone from this world of wealth and power. Gregory scoffed, clearly unnerved by Nathan's defiance. He turned to Grace, his expression twisting with disdain. If you really belong here, why don't you prove it? Show us your papers. The words struck like a punch to the gut. Grace's breath hitched, her face paling. What? She managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory stepped closer, the cruel gleam in his eyes unmistakable. You heard me. If you've got nothing to hide, prove it. Otherwise, maybe we should call someone to check. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Nathan's face darkened, his fists trembling with barely contained rage. That's enough, Nathan growled, his voice sharp. You're out of line, Gregory. But Gregory ignored him, his eyes still fixed on Grace. "Why so quiet?" he pressed. "It's a simple question. Do you have papers, or don't you?" The words echoed through Grace's mind, each syllable hitting like a hammer. Her hands shook as she clenched them at her sides, her chest tight with a mix of anger, fear, and helplessness. She wanted to scream, to shout, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Before anyone could speak, another voice broke the silence. "Everything okay back here?" The group turned sharply to see Elon Musk standing in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. His presence sucked the air out of the room, and for a moment, no one moved. Gregory straightened quickly, the smugness on his face faltering. "Mr. Musk," he said, forcing a smile, "we were just having a discussion." "Is that right?" Elon interrupted, his voice cool and measured. His gaze flicked between Gregory, Nathan, and Grace, lingering on each of them for a moment before settling back on Gregory. For the first time, Gregory looked genuinely uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, stepping back slightly. "Yes, sir. Just trying to clear something up." Elon said nothing, his expression unreadable. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then, without warning, he turned to Nathan and said calmly, "Why don't you go back to the ballroom?" Nathan hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave, but Elon's tone left no room for argument. With one last glare at Gregory, Nathan turned and stalked out of the room. Elon shifted his gaze back to Grace, his expression softening just slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Grace nodded faintly, though her hands were still trembling. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Elon's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned back to Gregory, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll deal with this later." Gregory blinked, his face paling slightly. "Mr. Musk, I didn't mean..." But Elon had already turned his back, dismissing him without another word. Grace watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding as the weight of everything pressed down on her. Something was happening, something she didn't understand yet. But whatever it was, she knew tonight was far from over. Grace's legs felt like lead as she remained frozen near the kitchen entrance, her tray abandoned. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her mind still reeling from Gregory's last words. "Show us your papers." Those words carried the weight of accusation, heavy with cruelty and injustice. In the empty hallway, Elon Musk's presence lingered like an invisible force, though he had stepped away moments ago. Grace could still feel his sharp gaze as though he had left a mark on the room. Gregory remained near the counter, sipping his whiskey with smug satisfaction, as though he had won some unspoken contest. Margaret hovered behind Grace, her face lined with concern. "Come with me," Margaret whispered urgently, tugging Grace's arm. "You don't need to deal with this anymore." But before Grace could move, another sharp voice filled the space. "Are you all seriously hiding back here?" A woman in an emerald green dress swept into the room, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. It was the same woman from earlier, the one who had whispered about Grace not belonging. She carried herself with an air of entitlement, her chin raised as though surveying her kingdom. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice full of mock concern as her gaze landed on Grace. "Why does the help look so rattled?" Margaret stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is none of your business," she said firmly. The woman let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "None of my business? Forgive me, but when I'm paying thousands to attend an event of this caliber, I'd hope for a little more professionalism from the staff." Grace swallowed hard, her eyes flicking downward to avoid the woman's piercing glare. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the floorboards, but the hallway seemed to shrink with every word. Gregory leaned against the counter, smirking as though the woman's presence emboldened him further. "I was just saying," he added lazily, "that someone like her probably doesn't even have the right to be here." The woman's eyes flashed with interest, and she turned back to Grace, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "Is that true?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Are you here legally?" The air thickened, every word stabbing at Grace like a needle. Margaret moved to step in, but Grace's voice broke through before she could. "Stop," Grace said, her voice shaking but clear. She looked up, locking eyes with the woman. "You don't get to talk to me like that." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by Grace's defiance. Gregory, however, laughed. "Oh, listen to this," he mocked. "The maid has a backbone. How charming." Nathan's voice cut through the air like a whip. "You've both gone too far." Gregory's smirk faltered as Nathan stormed back into the room, his face red with frustration. "This is disgusting," Nathan said, his voice loud and sharp. "You're both standing here, ganging up on someone who has done absolutely nothing wrong." "Relax, Nathan," Gregory shot back, though there was an edge to his voice now. "We're just asking questions. If she belongs here, there's no harm in proving it, right?" "Enough," Nathan barked, stepping between Gregory and Grace. He turned to face Gregory fully, his fists clenching at his sides. "Do you even hear yourself? You're acting like trash." Gregory's expression darkened, his smile vanishing. "Careful, kid," he warned. "You might want to watch who you're talking to." Nathan shook his head, his voice trembling with anger. "I don't care who you are. You don't get to treat people like this, like they're less than you. You don't know anything about her." The woman in emerald rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Why are you defending her? What is she to you? Just another maid. Replaceable, forgettable." Grace flinched, her stomach twisting painfully at the words. For a moment, she wondered why Nathan was even bothering to defend her. What was the point? These people weren't going to change. Gregory took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You know what, Nathan? If you care so much about her, maybe you're hiding something too. Maybe you know something the rest of us don't. Otherwise, why would you defend someone like her?" Nathan spun around to face him, his face flushed with fury. "Someone like her?" he repeated icily. "You're a coward, Gregory. A bigoted coward. And you don't deserve to be here any more than you think she does." Gregory's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his glass. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was thick and suffocating. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the hallway opened, and the hum of the ballroom swelled again. Elon Musk stepped into view, his presence quiet but commanding. The tension in the room shifted instantly as his gaze swept across the scene. Gregory straightened, his smug grin returning as though he'd found an ally. "Mr. Musk," he said smoothly, turning toward Elon. "We were just discussing an issue with the staff." Elon didn't respond immediately. His sharp gaze moved over the group, lingering on Gregory, then Nathan, before finally landing on Grace. She stood frozen, her head bowed slightly as though bracing for more humiliation. "What issue?" Elon asked finally, his voice calm but cool. Gregory's smile faltered slightly at Elon's tone. "I was just saying," he explained quickly, "that there are certain standards that should be upheld here. Your staff reflects on you, after all." Elon's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed seemed to suck the air from the room. Gregory shifted nervously, clearly expecting support that wasn't coming. Nathan stepped forward, his voice steady as he said, "He's been harassing Grace. Him and that woman. They've been accusing her of things they have no right to say." Elon turned his gaze to Nathan, his brow lifting slightly. "Is that true?" Nathan nodded firmly. "Yes, and it's wrong." For the first time that night, Grace lifted her head, her eyes meeting Elon's. She saw something in his gaze that she hadn't expected. Something calm, steady, and deeply unreadable. Elon looked back at Gregory, his voice cool and clipped. "Perhaps you've had enough to drink." Gregory blinked, his face paling slightly. "What? No, Mr. Musk. I said, perhaps you've had enough," Elon repeated. "I suggest you rejoin the other guests." Gregory hesitated, clearly torn between arguing and backing down. Finally, with a tight nod, he turned on his heel and stalked out of the hallway, the woman in emerald trailing after him with a scowl. As soon as they were gone, the air seemed to shift again. Elon turned back to Grace, his expression unreadable as he said quietly, "Are you all right?" Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight as she nodded faintly. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Nathan, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned and walked back toward the ballroom, leaving the room heavy with unanswered questions. Grace let out a shaky breath, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly. But even as the hallway fell silent, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something she couldn't quite see yet. The silence in the hallway was thin and brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. Grace stood motionless near the counter, her trembling hands gripping the edges as though to anchor herself. Margaret hovered protectively nearby, her lips pressed into a line of quiet fury, while Nathan paced back and forth like a caged animal. Elon Musk's departure back to the ballroom had done little to ease the room's tension. If anything, the storm lingered heavier in his absence. The weight of unspoken words seemed to hang in the air, ready to detonate. Then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps broke the stillness. Gregory Barron strode back into the hallway, his whiskey glass now abandoned. His smile was gone, replaced by something harder and meaner, the alcohol in his veins sharpening the cruelty in his voice. The woman in emerald had reappeared behind him, her arms crossed as though she were an accomplice in whatever plan Gregory was concocting. "I'm not done here," Gregory announced, his voice slicing through the silence like a knife. He looked directly at Grace, his gaze cold and predatory. "I don't like being embarrassed, and I don't like unanswered questions." Nathan stopped pacing, spinning to face Gregory. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice furious. "My father told you to leave. You've already done enough damage." Gregory ignored him, stalking closer to Grace with slow, deliberate strides. "I'm asking her a question. Simple, really. Do you have the right to be here, Grace?" The way he said her name felt like venom. Margaret moved to step in, her voice quivering with controlled anger. "You do not have the right to speak to her like that." But Gregory waved a dismissive hand at Margaret, as though she were a fly buzzing in his ear. "This doesn't concern you." Nathan stepped forward, placing himself between Gregory and Grace, his shoulders squared and fists curled at his sides. "This stops now," he snapped, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to harass people because you think you're entitled to." Gregory smirked, though there was no warmth to it. "Oh, please, Nathan," he sneered. "Don't act so righteous. I'm just trying to make sure we don't have a scandal on our hands. Your father wouldn't want someone unqualified here, would he?" Grace flinched at the word, unqualified, her breath catching painfully in her throat. She had been strong for so long, but this, the whispers, the stares, the relentless accusations, was beginning to chip away at the walls she had built to protect herself. Gregory tilted his head, his voice growing sharper. "What are you hiding, Grace?" Grace swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward Margaret, then Nathan, then back to Gregory. She wanted to shout, to scream, to tell him to go to hell, but the words wouldn't come. "Stop," Nathan barked, his voice louder this time. "You've crossed the line. I'll make sure my father knows exactly what you're doing." Gregory laughed sharply, cutting him off. "Your father," he mocked. "Oh, I'm sure he'll appreciate hearing how his son is playing hero for someone who doesn't belong. Or maybe you're hiding something too, Nathan. Maybe you know she doesn't have papers, and you're trying to cover for her." Nathan's face flushed with rage, his hands trembling. "You're a miserable coward," he hissed. "Picking on someone because you think she can't fight back. Well, you're wrong. I'm not letting you do this." The woman in emerald finally spoke up, her voice loud and dramatic. "Nathan, you're making a scene," she scolded. "You're just embarrassing yourself now." Gregory's right. Why doesn't she just prove she's allowed to be here? It's not that hard. Unless, of course, she's hiding something. Nathan turned to the woman, his voice dripping with disgust. "Are you listening to yourselves? You sound like a pack of vultures, tearing someone apart because it makes you feel powerful." Gregory's smirk widened as he turned his attention back to Grace, his voice soft but dripping with malice. "So, what's it going to be?" he asked slowly. "You show us your papers, or we'll just have to assume the worst." Grace's hands trembled, her breathing ragged. Her vision blurred as tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them back, refusing to give Gregory the satisfaction. The knot in her chest tightened until it felt like she couldn't breathe. Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "That's enough. You're nothing but a bully, Gregory. You..." "Let her speak for herself," Gregory interrupted, his voice rising. "Go on, Grace. Tell us. Prove you belong here." The words echoed in Grace's mind, sharp and merciless. Prove you belong here. She couldn't. She knew she couldn't. Her breath hitched, her composure shattering as she whispered, "I don't have to prove anything to you." Gregory's grin widened triumphantly. "There it is," he said, his voice smug. "I knew it. She's hiding something." Nathan spun around, his voice thunderous now. "Are you insane? You're harassing someone, cornering her, because of your own twisted ideas. This has gone far enough." Before Gregory could respond, another voice broke through the chaos, calm, steady, and unmistakable. "What's happening here?" The group turned as one to see Elon Musk standing in the doorway once again, his sharp gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. Unlike before, his presence now felt like a storm cloud rolling in, quiet but heavy with the promise of something about to break. Gregory hesitated, visibly shrinking beneath Elon's gaze, but quickly recovered. "Mr. Musk," he began smoothly, "I was just trying to clarify something with the staff. There's been a misunderstanding, and I thought..." Elon lifted a hand, silencing him. "I didn't ask for an explanation," he said coldly, his voice carrying authority that seemed to silence the room. His gaze shifted to Grace, his expression unreadable. "Grace," he said quietly, "are you okay?" Grace's throat tightened as she nodded faintly, though her voice failed her. Elon's gaze snapped back to Gregory, his tone sharper now. "I suggest you stop talking." Gregory blinked, his face paling slightly. "But Mr. Musk, I..." "Enough," Elon said, the word final and undeniable. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the faint hum of laughter and music from the ballroom beyond. Grace couldn't tear her eyes away from Elon. For the first time that night, she felt like someone had lifted the weight pressing down on her chest. But even as the tension eased, she knew the night wasn't over yet. Something was happening, something bigger than she could understand. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she should feel hope or fear. The hallway felt impossibly still. Gregory Barron froze in place, his smug bravado visibly faltering under Elon Musk's piercing gaze. For the first time that evening, the air seemed to weigh on Gregory like a crushing force, pressing the arrogance out of him inch by inch. Elon stepped forward, his hands still in the pockets of his tailored black suit. His expression remained cool, detached even, but there was a weight behind his words that silenced everyone in the room. "Gregory," he began calmly, his tone low and measured, "I've noticed you've been very vocal tonight." Gregory shifted uneasily, trying to recover some of his lost confidence. "Mr. Musk, I was simply trying to clarify something," he stammered, glancing briefly at Grace as though she were the root of the problem. "You know how these things go. It's important to maintain standards." Elon tilted his head slightly, cutting Gregory off mid-sentence with nothing but a look. "Standards," he repeated softly, as though testing the weight of the word. He took another step forward, and Gregory instinctively stepped back, bumping into the counter. "You think humiliating someone in front of a crowd is about maintaining standards? Is that what you're telling me?" Gregory's face flushed red, a mix of anger and embarrassment rising to the surface. "It wasn't like that," he said quickly, his voice turning defensive. "I just..." "Stop." Elon's voice, though quiet, sliced through the room like a blade. The one word rang with finality. Gregory's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Elon turned his attention to Grace, who stood frozen, her eyes wide and wary. For a moment, Elon simply regarded her, his expression softening just slightly. "You don't have to answer anyone's questions," he said firmly, his voice kind in contrast to the steely tone he'd used moments before. "Not to them." Grace's breath caught in her throat. For the first time all evening, someone had said the words she'd wanted to hear. Someone had seen her not as a problem to be solved, not as an easy target, but as a human being. Margaret let out a soft, shaky breath of relief, while Nathan straightened, his fists relaxing at his sides. The tension in his shoulders eased as he realized Elon was taking control of the situation. Elon shifted his gaze back to Gregory, and the calm veneer in his expression cracked, revealing the slightest hint of fury simmering beneath the surface. "Gregory," he said slowly, "you've embarrassed yourself tonight." Gregory's face turned a deeper shade of red. You were harassing someone who works harder in a single day than you probably have in your entire life." Elon interrupted sharply, his voice rising slightly. The words landed like hammer blows, echoing through the hallway. "And you did it because you thought no one would stop you, because you assumed you were untouchable. Well, you're not." Gregory's jaw fell open, stunned into silence. The woman in the emerald dress tried to shrink out of sight, her earlier smugness replaced with wide-eyed panic. "And since you care so much about qualifications," Elon continued, his tone icy, "let's address that. Grace works here because she is dedicated, trustworthy, and excellent at what she does. That's more than I can say for you, Gregory." The hallway fell deathly silent. Gregory looked around, desperate for some kind of support, but no one met his gaze. Nathan's lips curved into the faintest smirk of satisfaction, while Margaret stood tall, her pride for Grace radiating in her expression. Gregory finally seemed to find his voice again, though it was shaky at best. "Mr. Musk, with all due respect, you don't understand." "No," Elon said, his voice cutting through like a whip. "You don't understand. You assumed Grace didn't belong here because of your own prejudices, because of the way she looks, because of the color of her skin. That tells me everything I need to know about you." Gregory sputtered, his composure cracking entirely. I didn't mean." "You did," Elon snapped, his calm veneer now entirely gone. "You meant every word, and you thought you could get away with it. But not tonight. Not here." Gregory shrank back, his shoulders slumping as the full weight of Elon's words settled over him. The woman in emerald shifted awkwardly, clearly desperate to avoid becoming the next target of Elon's anger. Nathan stepped forward, his voice firm but quieter now. "You owe her an apology," he said, gesturing toward Grace. "Both of you." Gregory's face twisted with anger and humiliation, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. He looked at Grace, his lips parting slightly, but the words wouldn't come. The woman in emerald let out a huff of frustration and turned sharply, stalking out of the hallway without another word. Elon stepped aside, his gaze still locked on Gregory. "Leave," he ordered flatly. "You're done here." Gregory hesitated for a moment, as though considering whether to argue, but one look at Elon's expression told him there was no point. With a mumbled curse under his breath, he turned and stormed out of the hallway, his footsteps echoing like the last remnants of his shattered arrogance. The hallway fell silent once again. Grace let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling slightly. She looked at Elon, who was watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elon shook his head slightly. "You don't owe me thanks," he said gently. "No one should have to put up with what you did tonight." Margaret stepped forward, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You handled yourself well," she said softly, her voice full of pride. "Better than most people would." Nathan nodded in agreement. "You didn't deserve any of that," he added, his voice softer now. "And I'm sorry it happened." Grace blinked back tears, her chest tightening as a wave of relief washed over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, truly seen. Elon turned to Nathan, his tone lighter now. "Why don't you take Grace back to the ballroom?" he suggested. "She's earned a moment to stand tall." Nathan grinned slightly, nodding. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the doorway. "You're not hiding back here anymore." As Grace followed Nathan toward the ballroom, she glanced back at Elon one last time. He met her gaze and gave her the faintest hint of a smile, one that seemed to say, "You belong here." The ballroom was a far cry from the quiet chaos of the hallway. Guests were still mingling, the clink of champagne glasses and bursts of laughter filling the air like nothing had happened. But when Gregory Barron returned, his face flushed, his confidence shattered. It was as though the entire room sensed the shift. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people noticed him slink toward the corner like a man who had just lost a battle. The woman in emerald, trailing him awkwardly, refused to meet anyone's gaze. A few guests exchanged puzzled glances, while others murmured among themselves, speculating on what could have happened. Near the center of the room, Grace stood beside Nathan, her back straighter than it had been all evening. She held her tray tightly, her hands still trembling slightly, but her face was calm, determined, even. Nathan grinned beside her, as though he couldn't be prouder. And then Elon Musk entered. The moment he walked into the ballroom, the air seemed to shift again. His presence was magnetic. Conversation stalled, and all eyes turned toward him as he made his way toward the center of the room. Without a word, the energy shifted, like the wind before a storm. But it wasn't anger or cold fury on Elon's face this time. It was purpose. Everyone, Elon said, his voice carrying over the hum of the room with ease. If I could have your attention for a moment. The murmurs fell to silence. I'm not one for public confrontations, Elon began, his tone steady, though his eyes glimmered with an edge of steel. But something happened tonight that I think needs to be addressed. It's not often that we stop to ask ourselves what kind of people we truly are, what we stand for when no one is watching. Tonight was a test for everyone in this room, and some of us failed. Gregory shifted uncomfortably in the corner, but Elon ignored him. His gaze scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Grace before continuing. Grace, Elon said, his voice softening as he gestured toward her, is one of the most hardworking and dedicated people I've had the pleasure of employing. She's honest, resilient, and far more deserving of respect than most people I know. Yet tonight, some of you decided that you could belittle her, dehumanize her because you thought you could. A few people looked away, shame flickering across their faces. Let me make one thing clear, Elon continued, his voice rising slightly. I won't tolerate that kind of behavior in my presence, at my events, or in my company. Ever. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, as though pressing down on everyone in the room. Gregory shrank farther into the corner, his earlier arrogance reduced to ashes. The woman in emerald took a step back, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Elon turned to Grace, his voice gentler now. You didn't deserve any of that, he said. And you don't owe anyone an explanation for who you are or where you come from. Not ever. Grace's throat tightened as tears stung her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek as a wave of emotion crashed over her. The room erupted into applause, started slow, hesitant, but quickly grew into something thunderous. Nathan clapped the loudest. A proud grin stretched across his face as he nudged Grace gently. See, he whispered, you're not alone. Gregory's face burned with humiliation as he tried to slip out of the room unnoticed. But Elon's voice stopped him cold. One last thing, Elon said sharply, his gaze locking onto Gregory. Gregory Barron will no longer be welcome at any of my events. I don't associate with people who think they can treat others like they're less than human. The applause grew louder as Gregory froze mid-step, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He had lost utterly and completely. Elon turned back to Grace, his expression softening once more. And as for you, he said quietly, you've earned more than just respect tonight. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you come to me. Understood? Grace blinked back more tears, her voice shaking as she whispered, thank you. Elon nodded, his faint smile reassuring her in a way no words ever could. And for those of you watching right now, take a look around. What kind of person are you when no one's watching? Are you Gregory Barron, full of judgment and cruelty? Or are you the one who stands up, who speaks out, and who reminds others that every human being deserves to be seen and valued? Stories like this make us ask the question, what kind of person are we when no one is watching? Tonight, Grace stood in the spotlight, unwanted, unasked for, but not because of what she did wrong. It was because of what others assumed about her. Assumptions built on prejudice, entitlement, and ignorance. But here's the truth. Grace could be anyone. The person serving your coffee, cleaning your office, or walking quietly past you on the street. How we treat others, especially when we think they can't fight back, reveals who we truly are. And tonight, Gregory Barron showed us what happens when arrogance meets accountability. His downfall wasn't just satisfying, it was deserved. And then there's Elon Musk. He didn't use his wealth to flaunt power, but to defend dignity. It wasn't about the money, it was about the message. He reminded us that standing up for someone isn't about being a hero, it's about being human. So here's a challenge for you. What would you have done if you were in that room? Would you have stood silently, letting cruelty go unchecked? Or would you have spoken up? Better yet, how will you treat people tomorrow, those you pass by without a second thought? This isn't just a story about one woman or one night. It's a mirror, reflecting the choices we make every day. Choose kindness. Choose empathy. Because when you do, you're not just helping someone else. You're creating a world where people like Grace don't have to fight to prove they belong. Now it's your turn. What's your takeaway from this story? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget, real change starts with you.